So today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Brett Branco, who we extracted from his scientific career to talk to community. And he says he's really looking forward to it. So Brett is the Executive Director of Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. He's a marine scientist, Associate Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Brooklyn College and CUNY Graduate Center. And his research focuses on the impacts of urbanization and climate change on the estuaries and surrounding communities. So go ahead. And we really want to encourage people to have a discussion after. And well, there's certain things we'd like to know about what it's like to be a climate scientist, especially in New York City, you know. But how the establishment treats you, that kind of thing. So go ahead. So we're yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me. I did say I was really excited to come here and talk to you because I don't get to do this as often as I would like anymore. So it's kind of a treat to be able to do that. So I'm gonna, I'm very familiar with 350 and the various chapters and the kinds of work that you undertake. Very important work, and it's mostly aimed at mitigation. And I'm going to be talking mostly today about some of the work that I do. And when we talk about mitigation, that we need to do that at a global scale, right? I'm going to be talking more about adaptation, and at a very local scale, the city scale. Though the work that we do at the Institute is broadly applicable to any sort of highly urbanized megalopolis that's on the shores of an estuary, which is what many of our cities are. So I'm not gonna show much data today. I didn't think that would be, I didn't think people would want a lot of graphs and numbers, so I'm just gonna really give you sort of like an overview of why we focus so much on adaptation, and then maybe just a few examples of some of the projects and some of the research that we're actively engaged in right now in that area. And just to address the issue of being a climate scientist, we can come back to that later if you want. I don't even still consider myself to be a climate scientist, but I don't know anyone who works in the marine science world who doesn't study the impacts of climate on marine ecosystems and coastal ecosystems and coastal communities, right? So I think that that's an evolution that many of us experience from the times that maybe from when we were in graduate school, or maybe even very early career, to now. I think though climate change was, when I was a grad student, it certainly wasn't a topic that wasn't discussed, but it wasn't the primary focus of a lot of the things that we talked about. Overfishing, pollution and the impacts, urbanization and the impacts that it has on estuaries, things like that. But over time, right, the focus became more and more on climate because it was inescapable, right? You just can't avoid thinking about climate if you're working in systems like this in Jamaica Bay. So just very briefly about the Institute, right? So the Institute is a CUNY-wide institute, which means that it works with researchers and students from all 25 of the schools that make up the CUNY system. It's hosted at Brooklyn College, which is where I'm at. There's a lot of involvement from Kingsborough Community College. They have a vessel that we had built to use. And it's a partnership with New York City, primarily acting through New York City Parks, but also with a lot of involvement from the New York City Department of Environmental Protection and the National Park Service. And the reason that they were involved is because if you look at Jamaica Bay, most of it's parkland. Even the waters itself is part of the National Park Service. New York City Parks, if they had done this 10 years later, they probably would have had New York State Parks as, in this logo suit too. But they wanted to do more. They wanted to coordinate their decision making around resource stewardship and climate adaptation in Jamaica Bay and the watershed and beyond. And so the Institute was essentially created. The Institute was essentially created to be a user-driven right? To do user-driven research, right? Do research that stakeholders need, the city, National Park Service, the communities around Jamaica Bay, to help inform, the decisions the important decisions, the hard decisions that we need to make. We also work very closely with New York Sea Grant, which is a sort of a national organization that has state chapters in every coastal state, including the Great Lakes around the country. And so the Institute functions somewhat as what we call a boundary organization, meaning that we try to position ourselves at the boundary between science, policy, and community. And I kind of added this because we used to leave out the private sector, but they're super important too, to have in there, because a lot of the innovation is happening there. We need to work very closely with the private sector as well. But we do research, but we also serve as sort of a neutral convener to try to facilitate knowledge exchange between all of these different sort of sectors, which is very important, right? Because communities possess very detailed local, what we call local ecological knowledge. They also have like important lived experiences, and they understand solutions that will work within the communities. You need to be able to communicate that with government, and with the research community, right? So the research community can do the kinds of research that help support not just what's good for, not just the things that the government wants to do, but the things that the communities need as well, right? So we try to serve that role as a boundary organization to try to make safe spaces for those conversations to happen in a way that puts everyone on equal footing. So this is just a quick thing about our mission. I think the important thing is that when we talk about climate adaptation in the context of a place like Jamaica Bay or New York City, ultimately it's all about the well-being of people and wildlife, right? The environment. So we put that in our mission because that's ultimately what we want to be able to impact, right? We want to make people's lives better. We want to make a place that fosters biodiversity, and we want to make sure that we build in the capacity to adapt over time, and not lock ourselves into systems of constant failure. And we do research, we do education, we do training, we do a lot of public engagement, and we do science extension and communication. So we do a lot with little, like most organizations. Okay, I don't want to show this one yet, so I'm going to hide it with my body. Okay, so, so like I said sort of in the intro, right? Mitigation, super important, right? We need to decrease the input, we need to decrease the input of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere so that over what's going to take a long time now, maybe we can impact the trajectory of climate change, right? But then there's adaptation, right? So why focus on adaptation rather than just on mitigation? That's a question to you. Why focus on adaptation? Why do you think we need to focus on adaptation and not just mitigation?
Because we're not going to reach the targets that we have to.
Say it again?
We're not going to reach the targets for greenhouse gas emissions that would be necessary to stop sea level rise and so on.
Right, so in spite of the efforts of lots of people, we may not meet our targets. That's part of it. That's a good response. Yeah?
If we don't adapt, there'll be more and more chaos.
There'll be more and more chaos. Why? What's going to cause that chaos?
Because the systems will be overwhelmed.
Okay. Yeah.
Does it cost less to adapt than to, sort of try other methods maybe?
Yeah, there's an economic rationale, right? That if we invest in things if we invest in adaptation now, it'll save us a lot of costs in the future due to the devastating consequences of climate change, right? Any other? Yeah.
I'm thinking that change is the only thing that we can count on. And so how how we are ready to adapt. It has a lot to do with our flexibility of mind and structure and,
Survival.
yeah,
Yeah, I really like that response. 'Cause I used to tell my students all the time, like in an environmental science course, you know, that if things didn't change, then there would be no need for environmental science, right? Because it's really all about the changes, right? Understanding them and if they're adverse changes, right? Figuring out how to perhaps mitigate them. Yeah.
Even if we are on a pretty good trajectory for mitigation, there's gonna be still a lot of accumulation of greenhouse gases, and there's gonna be a lot of damage. We're already it's inevitable already that there's gonna be quite a bit of damage out
I like that response. Yeah, some of the changes that are occurring now are inevitable, and are gonna occur if we went to zero emissions tomorrow, we would still be experiencing, I'll show my next slide in a second, right? But we're still faced with not just decades, but centuries, perhaps, of changes, right? The momentum of the climate system can't just stop it. So those are all great responses, and so this is one of the few graphs I'll show. So this is from the IPCC. It shows global mean sea level, so in meters, right? So this is 0 to 6 meters or 0 to approximately like 20 feet. And the time scale is long, right? This is 2000, so we're about here. And this is 2100, so this is really 300 years. But this is just focusing on our current century, right? And the take-home message here is that even if emissions go to zero tomorrow, sea level will continue to rise. Not just for decades, but possibly for centuries, right? And the blue line is the, which one is it now? I'm forgetting now. The RCP, it's one of the meeting our targets, right? Meeting our emissions targets. So even if you meet them, sea level rise is still going to change. That's global, right? That's sort of the global. This is just New York City, right? This is New York City, 1900 to 2100. So this is the last century, and now, we're more or less right here. And it's like this, pretty much the same story. Even if we meet our emissions reduction targets, sea level is going to continue to rise in New York City. And the minus and the plus just kind of shows the probable range of those changes. But we're talking up to a foot, likely a foot for the remainder of this century, maybe a little more, maybe up to 3 feet. We're talking about, and that doesn't sound like a lot, that's just up to my knees or maybe my hip. But if you live in Hamilton Beach or in the Rockaways or any number of coastal communities, that's a lot. We'll look at that in a second, right? And of course, there's a lot of unknowns, right? Because we still don't know exactly how, like the Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet. We don't know how all these ice sheets are ultimately going to react. We don't know how global ocean circulation is going to sort itself out, but it could be it could be very bad for us, right? Yes.
I also mentioned that the relative rate of sea level rise along the Atlantic coast is higher than other parts of the world because our land is subsided. So the relative sea level rise is greater because our land is sinking on the east coast of the
Do we know
US.
why it's sinking?
It's sinking. It's a geological thing, has to do with the glacier melting and what's
If the glacier melts, then Greenland is not so heavy on the Earth's crust, so it rises up. Imagine putting your fist into a balloon and it has to enlarge somewhere else. But now that fist, that Greenland covered with a mile of ice, is going like that. So now other areas go down.
It takes a long time for that crust to come into equilibrium with the change in the weight. So we're sinking at a few millimeters per year, and then we have a few millimeters per year of sea level rise, right? So our relative rate of sea level rise in New York is twice what maybe the global average is, because we're sinking while the water's rising, so it looks like it's rising faster. Oh, looks like I'm advancing automatically. Maybe I am on a timer and I don't even know it. Okay, but this is important because on top of, actually, what was the next? What was the, oh, okay. Oh yes, this is an important statement, right? I'm not gonna read this to you, because you can all read it, right? But just a couple of things. This is a statement about the impacts of sea level rise on coastal ecosystems. And it talks about loss of functionality, biodiversity, but it says impacts will be exacerbated in cases of land reclamation. Well, guess what? Most of the neighborhoods around Jamaica Bay are built on top of, reclaimed land from salt marshes, right? And where anthropogenic barriers prevent inland migration of marshes. Also New York City, right? Because the marshes run into the Belt Parkway pretty quickly, right? Or JFK Airport, et cetera, right? So this statement is all about New York City. We're in the worst possible condition because we meet the reclamation and the barriers to inland migration parts of this, right? So we have problems, like sea level rise is a problem for us. I think another important thing to remember for places like New York City is that those climate change impacts are happening at the same time that we've caused fundamental transformations in the landscape due to urbanization. And it's kind of sometimes hard to untangle those two facts, right? The climate's changing and we've fundamentally transformed the landscape through urbanization. So this is a map showing Jamaica Bay, 1844 timeframe. You can see the Dutch have already kind of clear cut Brooklyn and Queens to create farmland. But Jamaica Bay here was mostly surrounded by wetlands, right? It was a backwater lagoon, very, very shallow, lots of sandy shoals that constantly moved around, et cetera, right? And then today, right, it looks like that. The watershed's mostly paved over. There's no natural freshwater flows in the Jamaica Bay. It's all sewered, right? It's all sewers and stormwater pipes. We've covered most of the marshland with airports and neighborhoods, et cetera, right? So that has made the conditions that people are experiencing now due to climate change worse than they would have been if we hadn't sort of developed New York City in this manner. So that's an important thing to think about. Whoops, where's the slide I had about, oh boy, okay, doesn't matter. So I'm gonna pause here for a second. I'm gonna switch to another presentation for a second, but this is why we focus on climate adaptation, right? Sea level rise is gonna continue change. The slide I was surprised I didn't see in here, which I thought I put in here, was rainfall, right? Our patterns of rainfall are changing as well, significantly, right? Not to say that what happened on September 29th, just last year, wouldn't have happened, in the absence of a changing climate, but those kinds of events, the Hurricane Idas, are expected to happen more frequently, right? Those sort of, the frequency and the intensity of those kind of cloudburst events are expected to go up, right? And that also has catastrophic consequences for people, as we've already seen. So that's why we're working on climate adaptation issues, right? Because we have to deal with those while we're addressing the mitigation. So what do we do at the Institute as part of our adaptation work? So I'm going to start by telling you about a project that we are working on, which maybe some of you have heard of, maybe not, called FloodNet. So FloodNet is a project we're doing to collect data on what we call hyperlocal, but it's basically the flooding that people are experiencing on their streets all around the city due to any type of flooding. It can be what we call pluvial flooding, the flooding that happens during these intense rainfall events, when the water systems just can't handle that much volume and it just overflows onto our streets. It's the coastal flooding from storms that we experience once in a while, and it's even what we call the sunny day flooding, You know, in some of the neighborhoods around Jamaica Bay and Staten Island, it's City Island up in the Bronx, for example, during full moons, right? Well, actually, let me back up for a second, right? Tides are that periodic rise and fall of the water levels, right? That we experience. They go up and down twice a day, every day. And how much they go up and down is closely tied to the phase of the moon. Because the moon is like one of the things that's kind of pulling and stressing that water and making it kind of bounce around. And so when the moon is full, or when you have a new moon, that means the sun, the moon, and the earth are aligned, and the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon kind of reinforce each other, and our high tides tend to be higher than when we have a half moon, when the sun and the moon are at 90-degree angles to the earth, more or less. So they don't cancel each other out, but the combined pull is a little bit less, right? So there are neighborhoods, and I'll show you data in a second, where on a full moon, they're gonna flood. Every month, twice a month, every month. And not just for one day. Usually in some places, that kind of sunny day flooding will happen over the course of maybe 3 days. So they'll get 6 flooding events of different levels of severity. And I'll show you an example in a second, right? So, so we started developing this project called FloodNet as a way to sort of, well, for a variety of reasons. Let's start with the community, because that's where the Institute started. We started with communities. They're frustrated, right? Because they know that they flood all the time. They experience that flooding. They know how it's impacting their daily lives. But they always felt like that information wasn't getting up to city government in ways that were causing any kind of response, right? And one of the things that we noticed was that communities shared a lot of information with each other, but within like Facebook groups, closed Facebook groups, right? Like the Hamilton Beach High Tide Facebook group, where they would share photos of the flooding that happens every month and talking to each other about the impacts. But that wasn't visible to anyone, right? So we started working with them to try to make that more visible, to help advance their advocacy. We don't advocate for them, but we provide them with the information that they might need to advance their advocacy. Their day-to-day decision-making, and to validate, right? To validate the 311 calls that they're always making to the city, right? So that's one reason why why better data was important to communities. That's what they told us, right? And they said, we don't want to just keep taking photos all the time, right? This is exhausting. So we'll talk about the evolution of the flood sensors in a minute, but so community is important, right? Researchers, right, do a lot of modeling to try to do forecasting for flooding. They wanted more data to be able to validate their models. They also wanted to be able to have ways of monitoring how flooding might be changing over time. And they also were interested in when flooding was occurring, because some researchers were interested in the potential contaminants associated with floodwaters and what the public health aspects of that were. And then government agencies, right? They wanted better data about flooding to help with their infrastructure planning and monitoring, so like pre and post construction, to see if what they're doing is effective. They wanted better data about flooding that was occurring at the moment to help guide emergency response, and also to do post-flood assistance and impact work. So like, for example, the New York City Office of Emergency Management was very interested in getting better data about flooding in the city. So FloodNet came to be, we're actually a team consisting of researchers from CUNY and our institute, but also some other parts of CUNY, NYU, working in collaboration with the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice and the New York City Mayor's Office of, it's now called Office of Technology and Innovation, and now we can also say with the Department of Environmental Protection, because they're kind of funding it now. So this team came together with the mission to develop tools for real-time urban flood monitoring, implement these tools to measure flooding in New York City, make flood data and monitoring tools accessible and useful to all the different stakeholder groups that I mentioned before, including community-based organizations, et cetera, right? So that's the mission of the FloodNet team in this project. We also thought a lot in our team about what our guiding principles should be for a project like this that's so important with respect to people's lives, right? So we came up with these guiding principles that we reference all the time to kind of shape what we do as part of this research project, right? And et cetera. We try to live up to these. We talk about these. It's not always easy, right? Not always easy when you're working with the city. What FloodNet is, fundamentally, is the deployment of these little ultrasonic sensors that are just constantly bouncing sound beams off the sidewalk or the road. But when there's water underneath there, it changes the time it takes for that sound beam to get from the transmitter to the receiver. And by knowing how long it takes for that sound beam to travel, we can kind of tell how deep the water is, right? There's been a lot of engineering going into these sensors, right? Because we wanted to be cheap, we wanted to be autonomous, cheap and autonomous is the biggest one, right? So you'll see these around the city. Right now there's only 85, but soon there's going to be 500.
How cheap? Like, what's the cost?
We got it down to less than $240 a sensor.
Oh, wow.
Now you can go buy one from the USGS for like, I think something like $10,000. Or there's some other research groups that are also developing kind of similar technology, but they're still up in the thousands. So our sensor engineers are actually kind of ahead of the game in terms of getting these things down to a price that, by the way, a community organization could buy 5 sensors, right? If they could come up with $1,000, right? Which is something we're thinking about. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
But that was part of the thinking in trying to keep the costs very, very low, right? And also just so we could just put a high volume of sensors on and get more coverage of the city. So this is what it looks like, right? We mount them to these little signposts. They actually are starting to look a little bit different because we're on like the 3rd generation design now, but that's pretty much what you would see. Has the unfortunate characteristic of kind of looking like a camera, which is why our community engagement and our community outreach are both important, so that we can communicate to people that they're not under surveillance, which is important to them.
I was on a trip around Brooklyn looking at things like that, and there was a sign by the sensor that said, "This is not a camera."
Yeah.
There was a sign that
Yeah, I mean, it's an unfortunate, maybe, we didn't have like a pro designer on the team at the time, and then there was a news story once on it, and the news, I couldn't believe she said this, the anchor, she said it kind of looks like a camera. So it just like planted that idea in everyone's minds, which was so unfortunate. The data go to a publicly accessible data dashboard, right? So if you go to this URL, then there's what you'll see is a panel that if you click on would take you to the live dashboard. So if you go on and look at it right now, I'm sure everything, actually no, we've been having some high tide flooding. Is that high tide now? You might see some flooding on Beach 84th Street. But anyways, that's what it would look like, right? Each dot represents where there's a sensor. The number in the middle tells you what the water depth is beneath the sensor. And it changes color depending on the severity of the flooding, right? So if the flooding gets above 4 inches, the dot turns yellow. If it gets over 24 inches, it turns purple, which it has done in certain locations, like around the Gowanus Canal. Community engagement is super important because remember one of the things is we want to make these data accessible and useful and usable by communities, right? So we put a lot of effort into not just outreach, because we understand that outreach is not a very deep form of community engagement, but we organize education workshops with community organizations to help people learn how to, read the data, understand the data, but also use those opportunities to get people's stories about flooding and how they've been impacted, et cetera. We just ran one in Flatbush 2 weeks ago, which was really great. And we're starting to work on curriculum that helps communities understand how to take data like these and use them as part of like their action plans. We solicit suggestions for where to put these sensors because we want to know where they will have the highest impact. We get suggestions from city government, we get them from community members, we get them from researchers, and right now we're trying to figure out how to prioritize. We have 700 requests right now for the 500 sensors that we are on the hook for. Actually, this is out of date. It says the DEP originally wanted us to install 500 sensors in the 4 years. Now they want us to do it by the end of this calendar year. So that's going to take a little bit more money than what you gave us this year, but
A little more time.
and a little more time. Okay, this is, I did not update this. Okay, sorry, I skipped by those because I'm also very mindful of the time. During a flood event, if you went onto the live dashboard, this might be something this is from that September 29th storm that we had. This is what it might look like, right? How many of you might have experienced something like this on September 29th? You did.
Like, I mean, there was kind of a clear line, like, across the street. It was kind of interesting just based on, like, the way buildings are. But there was, like, severe flooding. Like, there were cars that were underwater.
Yeah.
Where?
In Williamsburg.
Williamsburg, yeah. Trying to see where we might have had a sensor close to you, but this is at Carroll Street in 4th Avenue, down by the Gowanus. Little whirlpool developing over the storm drain. You can't really see, yeah, right there. There's our sensor. So we have one at that intersection. We were fortunate someone took a picture so we could kind of ground truth what we were reading, right? What were we reading? When this was snapped, it was 29 inches, but it actually peaked at 36 inches, right? So there was, a meter of water on the streets, right? So this is the kind of information that people can access in real time, and we are finding out that the city looks at this a lot to determine where they might need to direct crews to do certain things, et cetera. I know that there's a road in Hamilton Beach. Well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Hamilton Beach. There's only one way in and one way out. One road, and it's at the lowest point. And so we have a sensor there, so people will know, can you get out of Hamilton Beach during this flooding event or not,
Where is Hamilton Beach?
Hamilton Beach is, when I come back to the other one, I'll show you on the map
Thank you.
where it is. It's on the north shore of Jamaica Bay, though,
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
pretty close to JFK Airport, just a
Right.
little bit west of JFK Airport. This is sort of like a line graph. So this is like a time series of what a sensor was reading during. I think this was during almost 40 inches. So this was during Ida. Oh yeah. Oh no, this was during that 29th storm. Right. So remember I said it peaked around 3 feet. So this is what it looked like, and you can see how it corresponds with the rainfall.
And was there a full moon or no?
Great question. So this storm, it wasn't a was it a full moon? I think it was, and the peak rain came at the same time as the high tide. So we were getting flooding in some locations due to the high tide, in some places due to the rainfall, and in some places what we call compound flooding. There's nowhere for the water to drain, even if it, it's being conveyed by the piping systems. Where does it go? It gets dumped into the bay or into the East River or whatever. But if the tide is way up, the water can't flow into it, right? So you got compound flooding, what they call. So that happened. And then this is actually Hamilton Beach. So this is an example of what so-called sunny day flooding looks like, right? This is the flooding that they experience sometimes twice a day during the full moon. And we went out and did
And did people who live there
yeah.
express to you or any of the other people a desire to move away?
Right now, quietly. You see, what you see, so we're kind of in some of the Facebook groups, kind of, you know, not active, but kind of see what's going on. And you can start to see people express, that you see comments like, I don't think I could take this anymore, you know, I'm getting tired, you know, they're starting to express sentiments like that. So some people I think are just about ready. This is Beach 84th Street. So these little bars, those are all individual flooding events during that full moon period. So that's why I remember I said, it doesn't just happen once during the full moon, it happens over the course of a couple of days. Beach 84th Street is one of the most problematic places in the city for that kind of flooding. But they get literally, you know, 18 to 24 inches of water in the streets just because it's a full moon. And it's a lot of, you know, it's what people would characterize as sort of like a disadvantaged community, right? Low income, language barriers, didn't really know what they were getting into when they rented an apartment on that street. Kids have a hard time getting to school because they're not going to wade through 2 feet of water to catch the bus at the end of the street. So
If the bus comes.
if the bus comes, yeah. So that's one example of some of the kind of what I would call, of what I would call some of the adaptation work that we do. And then, yes?
Do you have data that can show that the flooding is greater since climate change?
Our sensors have only been online since 2021, and at that time we only had a couple out there. So, you know, I think, you know, there's some researchers that have done some modeling. There's other lines of evidence, you know, to sort of speak to that. I know that, because honestly, it's an issue that wasn't really on people's minds a couple of decades ago, and it wasn't really documented that carefully and systematically, and now it's becoming even more
To the
so.
people who live there.
Yes, exactly.
And they would know.
Yes.
This never happened back in the 90s
That's-
or whatever.
That's what we have a lot. That's what we have right now in a lot of communities. That sort of, you know, that local knowledge, you know, the anecdotal knowledge,
Yeah.
and we collect those, right? We
Yeah.
collect those stories, and yes.
Does the city like express some sort of legal obligation or just moral obligation to tell people before they're living in these communities what the history of these communities is?
Is-
Because I find that extremely messed up, honestly.
I think, I think in New York, I think that they just passed a disclosure law. Where
When people want to buy a house.
if you wanna buy a
But not
house.
for renters?
Yeah, not for renters.
Which
But
is
if you
the
wanna buy a
majority.
house, the owner has to disclose the flooding history and something else, flooding history and something else about the history of the home. Maybe other types of storm damage or something like that.
Insurance companies don't cover it without that history.
Well,
Long before there was any regulations.
Probably nothing.
in Brooklyn College, this happens anytime it's humid. Yeah.
It's a climate emergency.
You should evacuate.
Flooding up here on the
Put
fifth
your
floor.
boots on.
Yeah, probably a short or something.
Yes,
Sorry,
no.
I don't know.
he's gonna have to turn it off.
Here it goes again, it's still flashing.
Flashes, okay, the noise of the line. Okay.
And what plans?
So what is the situation in terms of insuring the house in Jamaica Bay?
I'm sorry. Can you-
I mean, what's the current situation about insurance?
Well, and I will say, I'm not an insurance expert, but we do pay a little bit of attention to this, right? In a lot of, not just in New York City, in a lot of coastal states,
Right.
but even in New York, Long Island, you know, a lot of, insurance companies are starting to pull out of flood insurance.
Right.
But the federal government, this is maybe another whole topic,
I know.
right? About how we enable
We pay for it, right?
bad behavior, or not bad behavior, that's not what I mean. How we enable bad decisions
Right.
about where we put people. And in the National Flood Insurance Program is a great example
Yeah.
of that. But we won't, yeah.
You want a New Jersey example? There's a town, maybe we should wait till you're finished.
Yeah, we can,
Yeah,
let's come back to,
Yeah.
because I'll be brief about, I wanna hit on one other area of work that we do that I think is important, but did you have a,
Yeah, I know the city is building a lot of green infrastructure like bioswales and rain gardens. To
Yeah.
what extent can they mitigate this kind of flooding? And also, are they using your data collection to place these rain gardens?
yeah, well, they want to use our data to evaluate the effectiveness of those kinds of strategies, right? We need to get to 500, we need to have, we just need to start accumulating some years worth of data. I really don't know why it's on a timer, but I can see that it is, but, so I'll just escape from this for a second.
That was just a test, by the way, the fire inspector is here testing the systems.
Oh, really?
Nothing to worry about.
There's limits. There's limits to what green infrastructure can do in terms of stormwater control, right? So the city has to adopt a variety of different approaches, right? So green infrastructure is an important one, but there's only so much space, right, to put it. So, other things they're doing, you've got what's called the combined sewer overflow facility in Patagat Basin, where they basically excavated, these subterranean basins, so that they can hold, millions and millions of gallons of stormwater during an event, and then when it's over, pump that water back up, and then put it through the wastewater treatment plants, right? So that's part of their strategy as well, right? To, they gotta hold water in some places, try to infiltrate it in others. They have to adopt a variety of strategies.
What's the name of that again, that you just mentioned? Where is that?
Patagat Basin. Don't ask me to spell Patagat,
No,
I
that's
was doing it incorrectly. P-A-E-R, it's Dutch, right? D-E-G-A-T-T. Area, something like that. So that's an example of a nature-based solution, right? Green infrastructure, and I want to talk briefly about another kind that we work on a little bit. So, so you'll hear more and more these days about so-called natural and nature-based features. These refer specifically to green infrastructure approaches to try to mitigate coastal flooding and coastal erosion. They're an alternative to doing things like building seawalls, doing what we call armoring the shoreline with riprap or revetment, so basically piling stones on sandy shores, things like that, right? So there's a momentum towards trying to integrate engineering approaches with nature, so that we can derive multiple benefits from shoring up our coastlines, right? Natural and nature-based features can mean a lot of things. It can mean preserving a natural ecosystem that's already there, or restoring a natural ecosystem that's already there. It could mean doing things like integrating seawalls, bury them, and then put a fringing marsh in front of them to try to create some habitat that you wouldn't get if you just put the seawall there, for example. So there's a lot of different approaches that people are taking to try to help stabilize our shorelines. In a place like New York City, there's only so much you can do, right? Because we've altered the landscape so much that there's a lot of places where we've made the conditions such that natural ecosystems just don't want to be there anymore, for a variety of reasons. So this part of my tale is like the cautionary tale. It's a positive thing that we're trying to integrate more nature, so-called nature, right, into our sort of shoreline projects these days. And the rationale is like, we can get some flooding mitigation, that we can prevent the water from coming up during storms, and at the same time, we can increase biodiversity by creating habitat, that's the thinking, right? And create better spaces for sociocultural activities, right? That's the rationale. We get all those benefits, right? We don't get just shoreline protection, we don't just get flood protection, we get higher biodiversity, we get, people are happier because they have these spaces, they can fish, they can kayak from whatever. And there's all kinds of approaches, and the point isn't to get into this, right? But why this is important is because, first of all, right, there's another new law in New York that says that that living shorelines, so-called living shorelines, which are one type of natural nature-based features, should be prioritized for shoreline protection projects. Right? That's a new Governor Hochul thing. At the federal level, we have the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is also prioritizing natural nature-based features for shoreline protection. There are literally billions and billions of dollars that are started to flow from the federal government. Oh, and the Mother Nature Bond Act, I forgot that. In New York State, we have the Mother Nature Bond Act. So we have literally billions of dollars that are going to be flowing into green infrastructure projects, including natural nature-based features. We still have a lot to learn about how to do this effectively, and whether it's going to do the things that we say it's going to do. And so that's a lot of the research that we're taking on. Yes?
Yeah, do you work at all with the Army Corps of Engineers and their sort of plans?
So, the Army Corps of Engineers has a program called Engineering with Nature. And they're actually one of they're one of the sort of like, you know, thought leaders, I would say, driving green infrastructure, natural nature-based features. That was a program that existed for a while, just sort of like within the Corps. It didn't always connect with the other operational arms of the Corps, and so a lot of the work that group was doing was not necessarily making its way into Army Corps restoration plans or coastal protection plans and stuff like that. It's changing, it's improving in that respect. But they also, the other nice thing though is that the Army Corps partnered with the University of Georgia to create something called the Network for Engineering with Nature, which is meant to create a national network of academics, nonprofits, a lot of private sector, like geotechnical engineering companies and things like that, innovators like eConcrete, who are doing kind of some interesting things. And we are now one of the newest members in the Network for Engineering with Nature. So we were just accepted into this network in September, so this is now allowing us to sort of like tap that national network so we can bring some of that learning into New York City, but also bring some of what we learn in New York City out to the national network. So I'm really excited about that. So the Army Corps isn't all bad, which a lot of people kind of. One other thing I did want to just mention, without getting too deep into it, is that with green infrastructure, in some cases, you can actually do a little bit of mitigation with your adaptation if you create conditions in which just the production, right, of the plants, whether it be mangroves or marsh grasses or seagrasses, they tend to be net exporters of carbon into the sediments, right? So people talk a lot these days about blue carbon. Now, again, in a place like New York City, there's not a lot of area where you can do this kind of thing, but it is possible to work on adaptation and get some mitigation in there as well. And I should also mention, remember, this isn't just about using natural stuff. There's also concrete involved in a lot of natural and nature-based features, but people are also working on different types of concrete that aren't so offensive from a carbon footprint point of view. Okay, just a couple more things and then we can, so just what are we doing in this space? One of the things that we're doing is we're working with New York State to kind of, we help them develop a framework for evaluating natural and nature-based features from Montauk to Buffalo, called the Measuring Success Framework. And it's meant to be a way to actually start to systematically collect information about are these things providing effective shoreline protection? Are they increasing, are they providing ecosystem services, or enhancing, let's say, enhancing ecological function? And do they produce positive socioeconomic outcomes? So that's one thing that we're working on. We developed a framework, people are collecting data using the framework, and now we're driving a process to figure out how to take all that information and put it into a format that allows us to sort of assess different types of natural nature-based feature approaches, compare them against each other, see what services they're providing and which ones they aren't. We are also doing a lot of the data collection ourselves, so like out in Jamaica Bay, your favorite place, there's at the Wildlife Refuge, to protect the West Pond. There's an artificial pond there, and to protect it from future erosion, there was recently constructed a living shoreline there. And we are now doing 5 years of post-construction monitoring, and the information we collect every summer then goes and feeds back into an adaptive management approach used by the National Park Service and their partners to try to fix deficiencies in the initial design and try to help this thing perform to its best potential. And it provides us with an opportunity to train students, right? Because we are at CUNY, and that's a super important thing is the workforce, right, for this type of work in the future. We also are working on the so-called regulatory impediments to coastal nature-based solutions, right? Right now it is easier to get a permit to build a seawall than a living shoreline. And that's because the state knows how a seawall works. And they know what its likelihood of success is. There's less information about how well a living shoreline is going to perform. And so, regulatory agencies are typically risk averse. So it's easier to permit the knowns than the unknowns. So we've taken on a project. We actually have a workshop on Tuesday. We're working with practitioners, regulators, and researchers, but the regulators, that's the important one, to identify what those kind of impediments are, where the sticking points in trying to employ nature-based solutions, and then come up with strategies to overcome it. This is like right in your wheelhouse, right? Because you guys are very good at figuring out policy leverage points and things like that, right? So that's basically the intent of this project, is to identify those leverage points to try to make it easier to do good stuff.
When you say regulatory impediments, you mean, let's say the state is paying for a nature-based solution, it's going to regulate that?
Yeah.
In terms of, I don't know, what are the parameters?
Okay, yeah, well, you should come to the workshop, because the first workshop we have is to basically put together the list
Okay.
of all those things, but I'll give you some examples, right?
And that would be regulated, I mean, there would be oversight and so on. It would be regulated by local
Right, so the
state.
Department of Environmental Conservation,
Yeah,
they're the New York State regulator
right,
for this
Okay.
kind of stuff, right? And the Army Corps of Engineers. And then, of course, also, if you're trying to do stuff in Jamaica Bay, you have the National Park Service, who also has to permit things, right? And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA Marine Fit, there's a lot of regulators. And all have different mandates, statutory
that's what I'm
mandates.
thinking, everyone's gonna have their own idea,
Yeah.
right?
So what we're doing, by the way, is happening all across the country in different groups. There's a group in San Francisco that's doing similar work, a group down in the Gulf that's doing, right? So we want to identify, we want to figure out why are projects not getting permitted, right? And then figure out how we might come up with action pathways to sort of overcome some of those impediments. So we decided we don't want to call it impediments, we're going to call it opportunities to improve the permitting process or something like that.
So Brett, we have about a minute.
And this is my last slide.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and then one other thing that we're doing is, with New York Sea Grant, we're working on just trying to again connect our local community, our local community of practice around nature-based solutions with the national knowledge network. identify gaps in our knowledge about nature-based solutions, bring together expertise to sort of like help us fill some of those knowledge gaps, and while fostering sort of like this growing community practice around this approach to adaptation, right? And I really do think that was my last slide. Let's see. Yeah, well, we don't need to do that. So, yeah, so that's it. So that's examples of the kind of work that we engage in around climate adaptation. That's a scary desktop right there.
You want 5 minutes for questions?
Well, no. Apologies, we ran very late and we really only have the space until 8:30.
Ooh.
So we ran a little
Well,
bit
could we
over.
just not have the...
Apologies.
This is so rich, so rich. What I'm gonna suggest is that, Brett, if you can send the notice of the workshop to Margaret. It's a Zoom, right?
No, it's in person.
Oh, it's
at
only
the
in person.
CUNY
Oh.
Graduate Center.
Oh, okay, okay, I thought it might be a hybrid or a Zoom.
Well, can we just have 5 minutes of questions, and then we'll go very quickly on our groups.
Oh, I'm gonna have.
You have that, okay, so just so,
Okay, what we'll do is with the report out.
I have so many questions, but I'll let you go.
okay, no,
Yeah.
just,
No, other people go.
no,
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Clock is ticking.
Yeah. Any other pressing questions?
About what Brett presented.
I guess my main question is how far back, like if I were to be like, I'm buying a house in Rockaway, how far back can I actually look? That's my number 1 question. Number 2 question is, do you think that these affordable buoy systems, as I'm just gonna refer to it, I know it's not what it's called, that measure the rise in real time, or is it gonna be possible for like a household in Florida to purchase one of those? Like, is that a realistic goal, or is this like...
We get inquiries all the time from all around the country and all around the world about those sensors.
Yeah.
People want to buy them. People in Boston want to buy them. We're not ready to sell them yet because we're still kind of tweaking the design, and we're trying to, come up with like a mass, design for manufacturer designs and everything. But that is eventually the plan. Is we will start making these available to anyone who wants to buy them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the second question about where to buy a house in the Rockaways?
No, I guess my question
Auburn
is,
in the sea.
but I guess
Oh, by the
just,
sea. I'm sorry.
like this legal, like the obligation to share this information
Mhm.
with the public, who is, their whole life's wealth depends on this one decision
Yes.
of buying a house.
Yes.
Let's just say. So I'm just wondering, like, how easy is it to access the historical data, not just like the last year, but the last 10 years?
How easy to access? I mean, it's there's a lot of information out there.
Yeah.
It's not always packaged in a way that easily consumed, and it's also not easily accessible necessarily. Which is one of the reasons, like, we have other programs where we work with community leaders to teach them some of the tools that are out there that their communities might find useful for their flood issues. And then they become ambassadors to their own communities about, through community meetings and stuff, they can then pass that information on. But that's sort of like an ongoing thing that we just started really. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
To an extent. And one more question. Is there any land in New York City that is deemed undevelopable, like unbuildable, like the climate risk is not worthy of the building?
Well, Judith and I were just talking about the community in Staten Island, right? That after Sandy, they abandoned their neighborhood. I think they came to a realization that it was just not an inhabitable place for them.
Yeah.
So, and then I think that land got transferred over to the. Yeah, there were buyouts, but then the city took possession of the land. But I don't know. Now you're gonna start to get the little cynic in me.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard stories about like buyouts, and then all of a sudden the land's being transferred to like private owners
Yeah.
to build like a
That's-
distribution
that's
center or
happening.
a parking lot. What's that?
in New Jersey, after Hurricane Sandy, the towns that had been really clobbered, and people said they had enough, and they left. And the land that got bought by developer, who built a bigger, fancier house. So the property values in the most severely damaged areas, the property values actually went up.
Yeah.
Because now you have a big fancy house. Instead of a
Municipalities
little
love that
middle-class
because
house.
they collect a lot more
The
taxes.
so it's really perverse. The whole situation is so perverse when you've got developers able to buy this land that's in harm's way and build a fancy house on it and then sell it for more money. I mean, how that's allowed, you know?
Yeah, and it's
Shouldn't
happening
be.
in Florida, right after the recent
Yeah.
hurricanes. A lot of private equity companies came in and just started snapping up the land that had just been essentially devastated by the hurricane, and they will build. I have a couple of colleagues, they were the ones that coined the phrase green gentrification around displacement of people after, new parks and things like that. And now they're working on climate gentrification, which is an issue.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's an important topic for another
Okay.
presentation, seriously, because it intersects with the Stop the Money pipeline, right? It's all part of, it's one of the tentacles, right? We're talking to insurance companies and we're targeting insurance companies and their campaigns against the insurance companies that continue to insure fossil fuel projects, exploration and infrastructure and so on and so forth, while at the same time individuals, homeowners and others are unable to get insurance against the climate effects.
Yeah.
So there's an incredible hypocrisy there, absolutely, and that the real estate industry and equity is buying up these properties that should not be developed. I think at some point, there's going to be a leveling of the playing field, so we shall see, right? People are still raising their homes from 8 years ago, Hurricane Sandy, and they haven't moved back in 10 years ago. So, we're a very stubborn species.
In other words,
Any other species would have crawled away and found somewhere else to
Yes,
live, but we just
absolutely.
keep going back from there. I apologize for rushing us through the next part, but we do have to leave by 8:30. A minute each for the people who are representing a working group, maybe announce when your next